welcome to episode number 4 of Dogs in Our World. Today we learn about dogs and the law. I think there's a little something for everyone in this show. We also have a really special featured guest for you to meet. I'm excited to finally get this episode into your ears. I think a lot of you will find something insightful in today's installment. The first part of this show will be a very brief history and definition of animal law. The second part of this episode will look at some present-day dog-related laws and issues. In the final part, and actually throughout the show, myself and our guest will share some simple tips on how all of us can be on the right side of the law and dog welfare. As always, we have a lot to cover, so let's get started.
You are listening to Dogs in Our World, a show that explores the history, science, and importance of the domestic dog. Here's your host, Adam Winston.
He is an animal welfare warrior. I mean, this dude is not playing. I initially set out to find someone who could just teach me something about dog law and ended up meeting with one of the leading animal law practitioners in the United States.
Full name, Adam, you need my middle name?
I don't care, whatever you want people to know.
Adam P. Karp is fine. And I run animal law offices, solo practitioner. I've been practicing animal law exclusively for, I think this is my 19th year.
Tell me about that book I saw on Amazon.
So Carolina Academic Press put out a book that's part of a series called Understanding something, right? So understanding criminal law, understanding bankruptcy law. So they created a new one called Understanding Animal Law. And I was asked to write it. So the book is about 700 plus pages, covers 24 or so areas of animal law, although that's certainly not all. There's probably another 12 to 20 other topics that I could have covered, but there just wasn't enough space, and they weren't going to wait any longer. Mm-hmm. So that book really encapsulates a great deal of my experience in litigation and legal research, and hopefully will help law students and just anybody who cares about animals and the law, help them to understand what the field is about, how broad it is, and maybe to incorporate it into their day-to-day.
Could you try to explain to someone like me what is animal law?
There are a lot of working definitions. Probably the easiest one is where there's just something about the case that turns on the life of an animal. Something about an animal, whether it's how the animal is viewed in a religious sense, for instance, how the animal is perceived at a genetic level, how an animal interacts with people at a social level, something about the animal's behavior, whether the animal is a perpetrator, a victim, a party. I mean, that's another whole push of animal law, which is to try to recognize them as legal persons, but that's not really what animal law is day to day. So I'd say any type of case where the outcome turns on, or something significant in the litigation itself turns on the life of an animal.
By now, you guys should know how I do. So let's start at the beginning and allow Mr. Karp to give us just a little background history of animal law.
Well, you go back to the Code of Hammurabi.
What's that?
Middle East, old codes. We're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, where there were laws that pertained to even veterinary malpractice. So I think if a surgeon, an early veterinarian, committed some type of malpractice involving a mule or a donkey,
what years are we talking about here?
Oh gosh, I'd have to look.
Okay.
Probably thousands of years ago.
I'll look it up. Trust me, I'll look it up.
Thanks.
Of course I looked it up. The Code of Hammurabi is a set of Babylonian laws from the time of King Hammurabi during the first Babylonian dynasty. This was from the years of 1792 BCE to 1750 BCE, or in other words, there's some super old laws that are nearly 4,000 years old. I guess if you're a law student or historian, you probably know all about them. And apparently, the Code of Hammurabi did include laws that addressed animals.
There would be a certain number of shekels that would be owed if there was some error made under the surgeon's knife. And so way back when, thousands of years ago, there were early codes that talked about the value of animals.
Really?
As a result of some type of medical error. But, I'd say that modern animal law really developed more in the last 40 to 50 years.
Okay.
So some people look at it as a form of cause lawyering, no differently than civil rights lawyers, women's rights lawyers, environmental rights lawyers, gay rights lawyers. So there are legal movements that typically are motivated by the needs of a underserved or underrepresented group. And there's often a paradigm shift that develops too in the law, but also in society when these movements sort of pick up steam. Animal law really, I'd say, is a spin-off of the environmental law movement, because of course part of the environment is not just, flora, but fauna as well.
Remember in the last episode when Dr. Hales blew my mind by showing me how looking at dogs and philosophy can lead us to bigger questions and connections like race? Once again, my interest in domestic dogs leads me to learning more about humans.
Slave laws in this country during apartheid and really the really unforgivable history of this country had a large body of slave law. And the slave laws really don't read much differently than the laws that I apply every single day to animals.
Fascinating.
So, when we talk about replevin is just a term that means essentially give me my property back. That's all it is. So if somebody takes your dog, maybe a boarding facility just keeps your dog, or somebody finds your dog loose on the street, doesn't report it to animal control, and just keeps it. You can sue those people to say, give me my animal back. And that's a replevin action. But yet, in the South, in the old slave times, you'd have fugitive slaves. Either they'd be helped out through the Underground Railroad, or they would just, run. And you would have lawsuits brought by slave owners against those who were housing the slaves, suing them for the return of their slave. And I wrote in the book, I talk a bit about the fugitive slave laws and liens that were placed on slaves, and how that type of language, that sort of judicial discourse really kind of presaged what we're seeing today. They even had judges in the 1800s talking about whether slaves are like stray dogs. Again, it's an insulting comparison, but it's also judicious to see the connection. So animal law is, in my opinion, although not entirely, of course, but is like doing slave law, because it's really just personal property law.
Wow, don't worry, folks. I promise. One of these days, I'll make a happy-go-lucky episode for us, and we can just take live calls and talk about puppies. But, for now, though, this is what I'm learning about, and I do feel a need to share this stuff with all of you. And I also don't want to think that I'm the only one who wants to learn this side of the dogs in our world.
The only other connection I'd say about old slave laws and the law at that time also discussed what happens if a slave is injured or killed. How do you compensate the slave owner? Again, though, we have to look at this as, at that time, human beings were owned by others, and which is why there's often a deep objection to talking about human beings owning animals. I think language is important because language does sort of create the world we live in and does, affect power systems. That's true. But really, at the end of the day, it's ownership that matters. It's title that matters. And so if a dog is killed or injured, then we talk about how do you compensate the owner for what the animal did for the owner. But still not the animal's intrinsic value to herself.
Once again, I'm purposefully avoiding some of the heavier, more gruesome parts of my discussion with Mr. Karp. I am, however, thinking of a way that I can share my unedited interviews on dogsinourworld.com. That'll be for those of you who can handle the more intense stuff. But anyways, let's move on and get back to Mr. Karp as he explains a little more about the what he means about the intrinsic value of a dog.
It simply is what we call non-cognizable. It's not recognized in the eyes of the law. So we're left with what is the animal's value tethered to a human owner, and that value could it could be looked at as what therapeutic value the animal offers, by helping the person sleep or manage anxiety, or getting them out and walking, or maybe there's a recreational value, or just a hedonic value, just a joy of life and enjoyment of having the animal in your life, which we know is true. But it's not really on the animal's own terms. What's that animal's life worth? Because, what's your life worth? That's sort of it's a very difficult question to put into numbers, whether you're an animal or not.
Do you know what yours is worth?
I don't.
We'll be right back with more Dogs in Our World right after this.
Support Dogs in Our World by making a donation. This fun and informative show is free to the public, but it's not free to produce. Every dollar donated goes directly towards production expenses. Help Adam improve the lives of dogs and people through more episodes just like this one. Donate today at dogsinOurworld.com.
Adam will be right back with more Dogs in Our World. For more information about this show, visit the episodes page at dogsinOurworld.com. And be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and SoundCloud.
Welcome back. In the first part of this episode, Adam P. Karp gave us a brief history and definition of animal law. Now, let's examine animal laws here in Washington State and how they affect the dogs in our world. Or should I say, we'll examine how the dogs in our world affect the law. Is there anything new going on? I mean, what's always changing or in the process of changing? What do you want to change?
Well, I mean, some of the laws that are changing, it's funny. I'm always amazed at the number of times that legislators float bills for dogs in bars. I don't personally get it. I don't know why it's so important to have a non-service dog sitting next to you as you have a beer, but okay, that seems to be a popular bill in Washington. The other thing I've seen is efforts to try to address tethering, so anti-tethering type of laws, because of course, it's...
Thank you for bringing this up.
Yeah, it can be considered cruel in certain circumstances. It can also increase aggression and protectiveness and territorialism of the animals. But mostly it's an animal abuse type of issue. And so I do think there are two bills currently this session floating down in Olympia that deal with tethering. And one of them, I believe, is going to pass.
What is it you mean by tethering?
Like basically leaving a dog chained up outside all day long, without adequate shelter, without adequate water or food.
What about when I'm going to my corner store and there's that big dog leashed to the to the sign in the next to the front door there? Is that legal? Just to tie your dog up out in front of the store as you go in and shop?
Oh, it depends on what jurisdiction. So, for instance, City of Seattle, the dog would be considered at large, because the dog needs to be actually basically tied to your hand. Can't be tied to an inanimate object or a post. I mean, many people do it, but the risk you take, of course, is that you've now lost control of the animal, and you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if a kid's going to be riding his bicycle right alongside the dog and get nailed. You don't know if a patron's going to be coming in or out, maybe with food, and the dog will startle them and they'll drop everything and break it. A lot of things can happen if you don't have your hand at the other end of that leash at all times.
Am I obligated to report that to animal control?
No, you have no duty at all to do so. No. We don't have mandatory reporting laws, except in some jurisdictions, there's a mandatory report if you find a stray.
Mr. Karp works to change certain laws. One law that he worked on for a number of years is actually an extension of a law regarding livestock.
This is a civil cause of action involving first-degree or second-degree theft of livestock or felony animal cruelty or malicious injury to livestock, which are all crimes. So basically what this law does is says that if you own livestock, and that's specifically defined, basically, I don't remember the exact enumeration, but it's like a horse, a bovine, a goat, a sheep, that sort of thing. If your livestock is the victim of felony animal cruelty or felony theft of livestock, which is defined under the code, or malicious injury to livestock, which is a relatively new animal abuse crime, then you can sue the person who did it for treble damages and reasonable attorney's fees.
And that sounds great, right? Except dogs are not considered livestock, and Washington State doesn't provide punitive damages in such cases. Adding the attorney fee provision would be the big stick, as Karp calls it, and would make guilty parties reimburse victims' attorney's fees. So, Mr. Karp put together a team to make what sounds like a reasonable modification to the law, right?
So this is a statute that benefits livestock owners in a very significant way. So it struck me as a bit odd at many levels that the legislature would have such a law in place for decades for livestock, but not for dogs and cats.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, how hard would it be to extend this law and just say, if your
and not
livestock,
far-fetched extension either.
No, if your livestock or companion animal is the victim of felony animal cruelty or malicious injury or something like that, or theft, then you can make a claim for treble damages and all that. It didn't pass.
Wait, what?
This was probably 8 to 10 years ago. We brought in some of my clients talking about their animals being victimized by animal cruelty and wanting to have brought such a claim but unable to do so. And it made it out of, I think, the first committee. And in the second committee, it never left, and it split on party lines. Democrats for, Republicans against. It was very odd to me. And then I think we tried it one more time, and we couldn't get any traction.
That's right. Even the dogs in our world are not immune to partisan politics. There was also a surprising opponent initially.
Yeah, the veterinary lobby was against it at first. I think they were afraid that claims would be brought against veterinarians, but of course the felony animal cruelty law already has an exemption for accepted veterinary practices, so they weren't going to be at risk anyway.
This seems far-fetched,
I know. Yeah, so that's a little bit of a struggle, but that's something I hope will change, because I have cases a lot that involve obscene brutality, and if the four-legged victim, were a goat, I'd be able to make a claim, but because it was a cat, I can't.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Another big part of animal law is dealing with lost and found. As Karp mentioned earlier, some jurisdictions have mandatory reporting of strays. For example, if a stray dog or cat wanders into your home and it's love at first sight, you still have an obligation to report to animal control. Of course, you may not have to surrender the animal, but there could be a concerned owner looking for him or her. And the dog or cat could be reported as lost.
If you have any desire to keep the animal, you've got to do so. And I've had so many discussions with folks who want to be rescuers or formal rescue organizations, and they will take in a stray, and they'll just put signs up, and they'll act as though they're animal control and try to find the owner. And after a month, they say, well, couldn't find the owner, so I guess the dog's ours. No, that's not the case. So they learn very quickly.
Could be microchipped. You got to check.
Yep.
While we talked about how the law gets involved with missing and quote-unquote appropriated dogs, Mr. Karp shared with me how some parties are able to take advantage of dogs being considered property in the eyes of the court.
There are a lot of emergency hospitals now that will say, we won't even do anything until you get care credit or drop $4,000. And they say payment is due at time of discharge. And if you don't pay, they keep your dog. They just hold on to your dog.
Is this a common practice?
Very common.
Even here in Washington?
Yep. Not really much different than an auto mechanic putting a lien on your car until you pay. Because the logic is they're going to get their money by keeping security in your vehicle. If you need the vehicle, that's the motivation to pay your bill. If they're going to keep your dog, the motivation to pay the bill is to get your dog back. And if you don't, then there's a state law that says the dog is abandoned. Okay? So, I think it's bad business. I think while it might be legal to put a lien on an animal, I mean, this is debatable in Washington. So what I'm saying here is that I don't think this has been resolved. I think it's debatable that it's a chattel lien, which is basically a lien that's placed on chattel or inanimate objects, typically, that are being repaired or kept for safekeeping, like at a warehouse, for instance. But there is no law in Washington that specifically says you can do that with a dog. A veterinarian can do that with a dog or a cat. On the other hand, I understand that animals are property in the eyes of the law, and if we're going to treat them as largely indistinguishable from, say, your laptop, then it is a logical argument. But I don't think I don't think they are indistinguishable. Nor do I think you do. so that's the difference.
Times are changing, and some courts are beginning to see dogs as more than just simple property. You may have read about some of these cases around the country where judges are granting custody to pet parents who separate or divorce. In January of 2017, USA Today reported that Alaska, my home state, became the first in the nation to require that courts, quote, take into consideration the well-being of the animal, end quote, and enable judges to assign joint custody of pets. There was also the Haussmann v. Dare case in New Jersey a few years ago. Haussmann and Dare were an engaged couple, and during their separation, they fought over the custody and value of their dog named Dexter. In that case, the New Jersey court also recognized the special value of pets and ordered shared custody. You can find links to articles about those cases in the show notes for this episode. Back to Karp.
So it was really momentous that the New Jersey Court of Appeals said, we are considering Dexter just such an item. And since then, New Jersey has had what are called Haussmann Hearings, which basically apply in any sort of domestic relations custody of an animal context, where the judge is asked to equitably consider the uniqueness, the irreplaceability of the animal in making a decision about whether to enforce that versus just paying off the party. So we're seeing that as a change, but that's what you see in domestic relations context. You don't really see that in, say, a lien situation where maybe you bring your dog to the vet.
Mr. Karp agrees that animals should be seen as more than just property in the court's eyes. He also understands the delicate nature of the issue.
There should be some judicial recognition of what's best for the animal in any type of dissolution or end of a relationship between co-tenants or co-owners. I think it should be considered. And instead of just strictly looking at who put down the money to purchase the animal or adopt the animal, or who has the license or microchip in her name. I think that giving consideration to really what's best for the animal, especially if there's allegations of abuse or neglect, should be a consideration. But it's asking a lot of courts, because courts already are dealing with a tremendous amount of burden in adjudicating family law cases that involve human children. And the last thing I think many judges want to do is to treat human custody cases at all like non-human animal custody cases. They don't want to go there. And so it's easier in their mind to just say, who had title and how did it pass, and we look at property law doctrine. We don't look at equitable considerations. That's changing, though.
Coming up in the final part of this episode, we're going to talk about some stuff that could affect all of you listening. Karp is also going to offer some free advice for those of you who own a dog.
We'll be right back with more Dogs in Our World. Be sure to connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. You can also message us directly via the contact page at dogsinOurWorld.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or SoundCloud.
Welcome back to part 3 of this episode, which is all about dogs and animal law. Back in part 1, Adam P. Karp gave us a brief history and explanation of animal law. In the second part of the show, we looked at Washington state laws and how animal law is evolving around the country from Alaska to New Jersey. Now, in the final part of this episode, I want to explore related topics, law-related topics that could affect all of us, including both those of us who don't have a dog and those who do have a dog. And what about those of you out there who, don't like dogs or know someone who doesn't like dogs? What rights or protections do people such as small business owners have? And I feel like those people that just get the $20 vest and so they can take their dog into the sushi restaurant with them, I feel like they're doing a disservice. I don't know. There's something I don't feel right about yet. What about the person who's afraid of dogs or is uncomfortable around dogs and then realizes that they're on an 8-hour flight next to one? Am I reaching too far? Where am I going with this? Why am I feeling these weird contradictory things when it comes to... I don't know.
Well, times have changed. There are articles that have been written. You probably want to take a look at a professor named Erica Fudge, Fudge. She's written a ton on basically animal-human bond and sort of the cultural underpinnings of our relationship with animals, particularly companion animals. And so her research is thought-provoking, as well as James Serpell, whose book actually helped me go down the path that I've taken. He wrote a book called In the Company of Animals. Serpell, and then to a lesser extent on this subject, Peter Singer, of course, who wrote Animal Liberation. Those are all important sources that will help talk about how things have changed. Our relationship to animals has changed over the last 100 years, say, and
in the last 20 years.
Well, yes, it's definitely changing. And so, with these changes, we have more and more human-animal interactions, and with the diversification and the urbanization and geographically packing more people into a tighter space and animals, because of course there are probably, I haven't looked at statistics recently, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are more dogs and cats and other non-human animals per household than children, or at least close to that.
There is an article about that in Seattle. Mm-hmm.
So, inevitably we are going to be having more conflicts. And so what you're sensing is for the person who doesn't have an animal or doesn't have a dog or is scared of dogs or is bitten by dogs or doesn't care for the noise that may be generated from disorderly barking dogs or the smell of dogs who may not be properly cleaned, what rights do they have in places outside of their dwelling? And so on an airplane, in the supermarket, in a park, of course they have rights. We have competing rights. But I can assure you, though, that although there's an element of fraud, so there is service animal fraud, and that's what
I think that's the word that I've been looking for.
That's right. Yeah, there are some states that have passed laws that make it a crime to engage in service animal fraud, which essentially is as simple as, asserting either by draping the animal in garb that suggests he's a service animal, or by telling somebody that this is a service animal, back off, when in fact the person is either not disabled or the animal is not trained, is fraud. And so, my here's how I look at it. I think that animal accommodation rules should not be limited to just those who serve. That as long as an animal's well behaved, I don't think it matters. I think they should let every animal in. At a restaurant, as long as they're not getting into the food preparation area.
City bus, the Amtrak
Yeah, they should
train.
be allowed everywhere as long as they're well behaved. And so, yeah.
Who is the person that decides what a well-behaved animal is?
Well, animal control would decide that. The Department of Justice, if they're involved, or HUD, if they're involved. Basically, federal or state anti-discrimination agencies who are called upon to determine whether the dog is acting in a way that creates unreasonable risk, whether there's some sort of undue or direct threat presented by the animal. That's where it's decided. And so our laws, the federal laws that deal with service or assistance animal access, all provide the rights of a proprietor to boot a dog, even a service dog.
Okay. And now what about the people who do have dogs? What are some rights or some laws or some things that you want the dog owners to be more aware and conscious of out there? Is there anything that you want to tell dog owners to make your job easier?
Most of the calls that I get are, in terms of dogs behaving badly, are going to be dogs who are rude, mouthy, and jumpy, and then that turns into a casualty. So they either lack leash control and the dog gets loose and attacks or kills or trespasses on someone's property, or knocks an elderly person down and they break their hip, or they rush a fence and scare a child into traffic who gets hit by a car, or a number of other scenarios where dogs are simply not being controlled, or there isn't enough mitigative steps being taken to avoid these inevitable, often, conflicts. So there's that. There's sound. Dogs make noise normally. And I get tons of calls on both sides. People saying, I've been cited for dog barking, and if I get 3 more tickets, they're going to remove the dog as a nuisance. Or I get people who live next to, nuisance barking, and it drives them insane. Like every time they step outside in their backyard, the neighbor's dog senses movement and barks, and they feel like they're under surveillance, and it's very disturbing. So, I see those cases from both perspectives.
Then what should people do?
And so my answer to that would be is learn how to reduce certain stimuli that create dogs to vocalize in a way that's either too loud, too threatening, or for too long, or too frequent. I mean, there are a number of aspects to the noise-making capacity of dogs. And so people need to be mindful of sound. They need to be mindful of aggression. They need to be mindful of feces, odor, so they need to clean up after their animals so that it doesn't result in smells that maybe overtake or waft onto neighboring properties and are disruptive, which also that odor may, capture the scent or create a scent for animal control to, come on the property or get a warrant and investigate possible neglect. So that's one big part of what I do in the laws that govern dogs. Yeah.
Did you hear that kind of sigh at the end? Can we all help Mr. Karp out a little bit so he can dedicate more time to the bigger issues, like his proposed extension to the Washington state livestock law? I mean, I'd rather he spend more time defending the animals who have been abused at the hands of guilty parties. Do all of us a favor. If you feel a dog is lost or stray, do what you can to keep him or her out of immediate danger and check to see if they were reported as lost to animal control. If you have a dog, don't leave them tethered and unsupervised in the backyard or outside of a store. Be considerate of others when you're out in public with the dog, and don't let your dog be a nuisance to neighbors. Clean up after your pet and do what you can to reduce excessive noise. If you're running out of options, consider hiring a professional and humane dog trainer, behaviorist, or a dog walker. Look for quality doggy daycares in your area instead of letting your backyard be the daycare. Look, I know that I'm not your dad, all right? And I'm not going to tell you how to raise your dog, but I know this. Adam P. Karp is a warrior who belongs in battle. I'd rather see him on the front lines of the animal welfare battlefield than dealing with irresponsible dog owners and folks who can't accept that the number of dogs in our world are only increasing. And also, I chose not to share some of the more serious and heinous cases that Mr. Karp is currently involved with. Again, you can check out my research links for this episode to learn more about Karp and some of the cases and projects he's involved with. And again, if you're interested in the complete, unedited version of my discussion with Adam Karp, then let us know in the comment section of this episode on dogsinourworld.com. If enough people are interested, I'll think of a way to offer the complete interview. Also, finally, if you're a law student or interested in learning more about animal law, Mr. Karp suggests that we check out ALDF.org. That's the Animal Legal Defense Fund website. It's a central source for anyone who wants to learn more about animal law. Again, that's ALDF.org. You can also check out Adam Karp's book on Amazon, which is titled Understanding Animal Law. Now, of course, I'm not going to let you go before I always do this. I always want to get the guests to give me their opinion, personal opinion, on dogs. Do you like dogs?
I do.
Why? Why do you like them?
I like the energy. I like the focus that they have. It's interesting to watch. It's admirable, actually. Some of the drive that they have is astounding to see, and the way that it's implemented in a way that I guess gives them a sense of working enjoyment, but also helps society is fascinating.
How do dogs help society?
Aside from what they can do for people as, family members, therapy, there have been a number of studies showing petting a dog lowers blood pressure, and dogs have an amazing ability to intuit even cancer for cancer detection, or epilepsy or seizures that are about to be early onset. They can maybe smell it. I think that's the science behind it, that they can smell it. And the power of scent, the power of a dog's nose is useful, of course, in detecting drugs or bombs, or even, and I just wrote an article on it, on cadavers. So there are cadaver detection dogs. And, to really, we don't fully know how it works, but we know it does. And the law recognizes that for various applications, such as finding, in search and rescue, or finding dead bodies, or finding inculpatory evidence. That's where there's use.
As we wrap up, Mr. Karp reminds me that our conversation only scratched the surface of my many questions for him.
All of that, which I never got into that with you, to basically say that animal law really is every area of law.
I was about to say, don't worry, you are welcome to come back for future episodes, and I will probably ask you nonetheless. There it is, our episode about law and dogs. Let me know what you think of today's show by leaving a comment and or rating in iTunes or whatever podcast service you may use. Thanks to those of you who already left one. I see all that stuff and I appreciate it. Please share this show with anyone you think might be interested. As you see, I try to provide topics that I think interest a wide variety of listeners. We're working on some really, really great things moving forward. Our website is always being tweaked with improvements. I'm also working on getting a couple really great guests. Since this show isn't going anywhere yet, I'm also forced to continue begging for donations. Please help a brother out and donate whatever you can by navigating to dogsinOurWorld.com. Finally, I would like to give a special shout out to John Nebendahl and his family's 2 Boston Terriers, Gracie and Wilbur. John created the new Dogs in Our World album art. It was really generous of him to donate his design talents to the show. Okay, don't forget to join the audience at dogsinOurWorld.com. Until next time, peace.